At 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, I opened my email and read one line that ended 11 years of my life. Your services are no longer required. No explanation. No signature. Just that. 11 years of loyalty, late nights, canceled vacations, and quiet sacrifices, deleted with a single sentence. My name's Daniel Ruiz, 43 years old, senior financial analyst at Redmond Capital. Or at least I was. Until that morning. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the screen, the coffee beside me going cold. It wasn't shock I felt. It was silence. A deep, heavy kind that settles in when you've been hit hard enough to stop thinking. I read the email again. Then again. Same words. Same finality. They'd chosen email because they didn't want a conversation. They didn't want to see the face of the man who had built their systems, fixed their books, and carried their company through 2 recessions. No, they wanted distance. Clean, bloodless distance. But what they didn't know was that firing me wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. That afternoon, the internal memo leaked. Redmond Capital was finalizing a $600 million merger with Stratmore Holdings. It was supposed to be the biggest deal in the company's history. That's when it clicked. I wasn't fired because I failed. I was fired because I knew too much. I'd built the merger model. I'd handled the numbers. And buried inside those numbers were things the executives didn't want anyone to see, especially me. I didn't react. I didn't send angry emails. I didn't post on social media. I just sat down, opened a new folder on my hard drive, and started sorting files. Every report, every spreadsheet, every correspondence. Years of data that told a story they thought they'd erased with one line of text. When my wife came home and asked what happened, I told her I was fine. I even smiled. Because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't the kind of man who begged for answers. I was the kind who waited. Quietly. And waiting, I've learned, is a form of power. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit. 11 years of routine doesn't disappear overnight. I still made coffee at 6, still checked emails at 7. Only this time, my inbox was empty. No meetings. No reports. No calendar invites. Just silence. That kind of silence can either break a man or sharpen him. I chose the latter. I spent that day reconstructing everything. Contracts, projections, valuation drafts. I'd worked on the merger model myself, and I remembered how hard the numbers had been pushed to make sense. There were discrepancies, hidden debts, overstated revenue streams, inflated assets. I hadn't said anything at the time because I was told not to. Let the executives handle it, my boss had said. You're just the numbers guy. But now that I was out, I wasn't just anything anymore. By evening, I had 3 external drives filled with data. Not stolen, copied. All backed up legally under my personal work archive clause. They'd forgotten about that clause. They always forget. My phone rang that night. Unknown number. I didn't answer. Then a text came through. We need to talk. Urgent. No name. But I knew the tone. Corporate panic always starts quietly. 2 days later, a news alert confirmed it. Redmond Capital had officially signed the merger with Stratmore Holdings. $600 million. The CEO gave interviews about strategic vision and streamlined success. Every headline praised them. Everyone smiled for the cameras. I just watched. Patient. Then, on the 4th morning, my phone rang again. This time, it was the company's legal counsel. I recognized her voice immediately. Measured, polite, but laced with strain. She said there were some questions about documentation related to the merger. I told her I no longer worked for Redmond. She said, yes, but you might still have access to certain financial data we now urgently need. I let the silence stretch. Then I said, I'm sure you do. That's when her tone changed. It shifted from polite to desperate. She said, Daniel, we may have a problem. I smiled slightly, though she couldn't see it. Yes, I said quietly. You might. After that call, I knew I had their attention. But I didn't rush. I didn't threaten. I didn't send anything. I simply waited. Because panic always exposes more than anger ever could. That afternoon, another email arrived, this time from the company's head of operations. It was polite, almost casual. He said they'd appreciate my assistance in locating missing documents. He didn't specify which ones, but I knew. The files they'd buried under projections and inflated valuations. The ones that could unravel the entire merger if someone looked close enough. I didn't reply. 3 days later, a courier showed up at my door with a non-disclosure agreement. No explanation, no letter, just the contract. They wanted my silence in writing. That told me everything. Something was wrong. Very wrong. That evening, I opened the drives again. The data told a story most people wouldn't notice at first glance. Tiny inconsistencies spread across quarterly reports, like hairline fractures in glass. They had moved liabilities between shell accounts, created short-term revenue from non-existent contracts, and adjusted valuations to inflate the merger worth by nearly $50 million. Not catastrophic yet, but if regulators saw it, the entire deal could implode. The funny thing is, I didn't need to expose it. All I had to do was wait for gravity to do its job. Numbers have weight, and lies eventually collapse under it. By Friday, I got another call, this one directly from the CEO. His voice, once arrogant and commanding, now sounded like it was being held together with caffeine and fear. He said there had been an unfortunate oversight. He said the company valued my expertise. He said they were open to discussing a consulting arrangement. Translation, they were bleeding, and I had the only bandage. I told him I'd think about it. He exhaled in relief. But what he didn't understand was that I wasn't trying to save them. I was measuring how much truth they could afford before the walls came down. When I hung up, I made a note in my journal. They think I want my job back. They still don't understand. I don't rebuild what was rotten. I just watch it fall. And that fall had already begun. The following Monday, I got an official letter, emailed, of course. It was framed as an offer for collaboration. In reality, it was a plea. They wanted me back as a short-term consultant to support the post-merger transition. I knew exactly what that meant. They needed me to cover the holes before Stratmore's auditors found them. I read the letter 3 times. The offer was generous, obscenely so. They were dangling money in front of me, hoping I'd patch the cracks they'd created. But it wasn't about the money. It was about control. And that, they no longer had. That night, I went for a walk. It was cold out, the kind of cold that makes sound travel farther. I thought about the years I'd given that company, the birthdays I'd missed, the nights I'd worked through storms while they sat in boardrooms drinking wine. 11 years of quiet loyalty. They'd treated me like a disposable number. Now, numbers would undo them. When I got back, I replied to their email. I wrote, I'm open to a conversation. Send terms. No emotion. No promises. Just bait. The next morning, their lawyer called again. This time her tone was softer, less corporate. She said they were facing regulatory delays due to incomplete documentation. I didn't need to ask what kind. She asked if I still had my copies of the merger files. I told her I kept everything. She hesitated, then asked if I could forward the final drafts. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said, I'll review the terms of my previous contract. You terminated it, remember? Silence followed. The kind that hums through the phone when someone realizes they've cornered themselves. She tried to pivot, said it was all a misunderstanding, that the termination was procedural. I didn't respond. I just let her keep talking until she ran out of excuses. Then I ended the call with one line. If you need what I built, you can pay for it. After that, I unplugged my phone, poured a drink, and sat in the dark. They thought they'd fired me to save their merger. What they'd actually done was hand me the power to destroy it. The next 48 hours were quiet, too quiet. That kind of silence usually means people are scrambling behind closed doors. I didn't mind. I wanted them to sweat. When power shifts, you don't rush to claim it. You let them realize they've already lost it. By Wednesday, they reached out again. This time, it wasn't an email. It was a knock on my door. Standing there in a tailored suit was the company's head of legal, Richard Kane. A man I'd spent years watching from conference rooms. Always perfectly calm, perfectly detached. Now his tie was loose, and his voice shook when he spoke. He said they wanted to make things right. I let him talk. He mentioned the merger, how Stratmore Holdings had begun asking questions, how a few discrepancies had raised red flags, how internal auditors couldn't find the final signed model because, as it turned out, I'd been the one who held the only authentic version. He asked me, politely, to share it. He said it would help everyone move forward. I told him I didn't have a reason to. Not yet. That word, yet, hung between us. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. He asked what I wanted. I said I hadn't decided. Truth was, I had decided. I just wanted him to keep guessing. Uncertainty is leverage. After he left, I went to my desk and pulled up the original financial model. The spreadsheet was a labyrinth of data, but hidden deep in it was a simple truth. They had falsified numbers to inflate their valuation. If Stratmore discovered that, the merger would collapse instantly, and Redmond Capital would face a lawsuit that could bury them. The next morning, Richard emailed again. They were offering me a consulting reinstatement with full benefits, double salary, and a 6-month bonus. I read it twice, smiled, and didn't respond. Because they still thought I wanted my job back. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't after reinstatement. I was after exposure. They'd fired me to protect their secret. Now that secret had a pulse, and I was the one keeping it alive. The weekend came, and for the first time in years, I didn't think about work. I thought about control, about how easily people give it away. Redmond Capital had spent over a decade teaching me how to follow rules, how to sign NDAs, how to stay loyal even when it hurt. What they hadn't realized was that I'd learned something else along the way, how their system worked. And more importantly, how fragile it really was. Sunday evening, I received another call. This time it wasn't from legal, it was from someone higher. The CEO himself. His voice was smooth at first, like he was trying to sound friendly. He said the merger was under review, that minor inconsistencies had been flagged by Stratmore's due diligence team. He said they were doing everything to resolve it internally. Then he asked if I'd be willing to help. I said nothing. I just listened. He kept talking, filling the silence, offering reassurances that sounded more like confessions. Finally, he said the line that told me everything. If certain files were to be made public, it could trigger a full-scale audit. That's in no one's best interest. I let that hang for a beat before I answered. I told him I wasn't interested in hurting anyone, but I also wasn't interested in protecting anyone who'd lied. He went quiet, then said, "Daniel, we can make this right. You deserve to be part of this success." Success. That word. It meant nothing to me anymore. When the call ended, I opened the merger documents again. Line by line, I followed the false revenue projections, the inflated assets, the buried debts. It was like reading a confession written in numbers. And every number pointed to the same truth. They hadn't fired me because I was a liability. They'd fired me because I was the only one who could see the entire picture. That night, I uploaded a single file to a secure drive, labeled it Integrity Backup, just in case. Then I wrote one note to myself: don't strike first. Let them reach for you, then let them fall. The next morning, they called again, panicked this time. Stratmore's lawyers had found something, and the house of cards was starting to tremble. By Wednesday morning, the news had started to spread inside financial circles. Quiet whispers, nothing public yet. But I could feel the tension rippling through the system like static before a storm. Stratmore Holdings had paused the merger, citing undisclosed discrepancies in financial documentation. That single phrase was enough to freeze millions in pending transfers and make everyone at Redmond panic. My phone lit up again, messages, calls, emails. They all said the same thing in different words: help us fix this before it becomes public. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I went for a drive. Long, slow, no destination. When you're patient enough, fear always comes looking for you. That afternoon, I stopped by a small cafe where I used to work through late nights years ago. Same table, same view of the city skyline. I pulled out my laptop and logged into my secure drive. Everything was still there, every spreadsheet, every model, every email trail. Proof that their empire was built on air. Then I saw it, a new email. Not from Redmond, not from Stratmore. From a journalist, a financial investigative reporter from the Ledger. She said she'd heard about my termination and the irregularities tied to the merger. She wanted to talk. She said off the record. I didn't reply, not yet. Timing mattered. That evening, Richard Kane showed up at my house again, unannounced. He looked worse than before, dark circles under his eyes, sweat on his collar. He said the SEC had been tipped off anonymously. He said Stratmore's lawyers were demanding full internal access. He said this could ruin everyone. I told him calmly that truth tends to do that. He looked at me like I was holding a gun. In a way I was, just not the kind he could see. When he left, I turned on the news. A small headline scrolled across the ticker. Sources report possible accounting issues behind Redmond, Stratmore deal. It had begun. They fired me thinking I'd disappear quietly. Instead, I became the quiet they couldn't ignore. And now, silence was working for me. By Friday morning, the story had exploded. What started as a quiet rumor turned into a headline on every major financial outlet. Redmond Capital merger under federal review. The numbers I'd built, the same ones they tried to bury, were now being dissected by regulators, investors, and analysts across the country. I didn't leak anything directly. I didn't have to. One file, one line of data, had been enough to trigger the domino effect. Stratmore's team must have sent it forward without realizing what they had. The cracks were visible now, and the light was pouring through. That day, I received another call from the CEO. This time, his voice was stripped of confidence. He didn't try to manipulate me. He begged. He said the merger was collapsing, stockholders were threatening lawsuits, and the board was demanding names. Who had known? Who had hidden the numbers? Who had let this happen? I didn't say much. I just listened. When he finished, I said, "You fired the wrong man." Then I ended the call. By the afternoon, the SEC officially opened an investigation. The markets reacted instantly. Shares plummeted. Commentators on TV were calling it a textbook example of corporate negligence. I called it balance. Around midnight, Richard texted me one last time. "They're blaming each other now. Everyone's lawyering up." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence was my answer. That weekend, I met with the journalist. Not to gloat, not to brag, but to make sure the truth was told properly. I gave her one flash drive, the redacted version. Enough to confirm corruption, not enough to expose private clients. I wasn't out for chaos. I wanted justice that would hold. She asked me why I didn't go public sooner. I said, because power doesn't panic when you speak. It panics when you wait. When the article dropped 2 days later, it didn't just ruin Redmond Capital. It buried its legacy. Executives resigned, the merger collapsed, and the firm's assets were frozen. 11 years of deceit ended not with a scandalous explosion, but with a quiet implosion, one that came from inside. And I never raised my voice once. A week after the story broke, Redmond Capital was unrecognizable. The firm that once ruled downtown Skyline had become a ghost. Offices half empty, calls unanswered, employees fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. The CEO resigned under health reasons, and the board dissolved within days. They were under federal scrutiny, shareholder lawsuits, and an avalanche of public disgust. I watched it all unfold from my living room, coffee in hand, every detail playing out exactly as I'd known it would. People called it a scandal. I called it gravity. You can only build so much on a lie before the weight becomes unbearable. The journalist from the Ledger reached out again. She said the public wanted to know who leaked the files. I told her to tell them no one did, that the truth simply found its way out. She asked if I regretted anything. I said, regret is for those who didn't act when they could. Meanwhile, the company's lawyer, the same one who'd begged for my help, sent another email. This one was short, almost pathetic. She said, "You've made your point. Please, if there's anything else, anything we can do." I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to do. That night, I went through the old drives one last time. I deleted the files, every copy, every trace. Not to hide them, just to close the chapter. Their collapse was complete, and I didn't need to carry their ghosts anymore. When I stepped outside, the city lights looked different. Cleaner somehow. I thought about those 11 years, the long nights, the loyalty, the way they'd cut me loose without hesitation. And I realized something simple. I hadn't destroyed Redmond Capital. They had destroyed themselves. I had just refused to bury the evidence. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was an offer from Stratmore Holdings. They wanted me to consult on compliance restructuring. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone ring. Because for the first time in 11 years, I had something more valuable than money. Silence, and the power that comes with it. 2 months later, Redmond Capital no longer existed. The merger had collapsed beyond recovery. Stratmore Holdings bought their remaining assets for a fraction of the original deal, just to contain the damage. Every executive who'd signed off on the falsified reports was under investigation. Some faced prison. Others disappeared quietly behind settlements and non-disclosure agreements. I hadn't spoken to anyone from the company since. There was nothing left to say. One morning, I walked past the old office building. The sign had been taken down, the glass doors sealed with paper notices. For 11 years, I'd walked through those doors before sunrise and left long after dark. Seeing them shut felt less like victory and more like closure. The kind that doesn't make noise, it just settles in and stays. Strathmore's offer still sat in my inbox. They wanted me to join as Director of Compliance, a title that, a year ago, would have meant everything to me. Now it just looked like another cage, cleaner, better lit, but still a cage. I didn't reply. I'd learned that freedom isn't about leaving. It's about never needing to return. Instead, I started something smaller. A consultancy. Independent. Quiet. Companies came to me not for growth projections or profit analysis, but for prevention, for integrity, for truth before collapse. The irony didn't escape me. The man they fired for knowing too much was now being paid to make sure no one else ever ended up like them. One evening, a message came through from Richard Kane. No company logo, no letterhead, just a single line. You were right. About everything. I didn't respond. Some truths don't need conversation, they just need witnesses. As the sun set outside my office, I closed my laptop and looked out over the city. Somewhere, another boardroom was probably cooking the next too-good-to-fail deal. Another man like me would sit at a desk, watching it unravel, wondering if he should speak up or stay silent. The difference is, silence isn't weakness. It's a weapon. They fired me to erase the truth. I stayed quiet long enough for the truth to erase them. And that's how you win, without ever raising your voice. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.